I'm going to read a quote here from Carl Jung, a book I've mentioned a few times called The Undiscovered Self, because it was the first time, at least to the general population, someone who understood these techniques was allowed to write them down and sell the books to the public. He understood the projection of guilt or anger within yourself that you can put on other people and point the finger, a technique that is childish, but you'll find many adults using it today in this day and age. This is what he says about the reasons that governments use. One of the many reasons the governments use for creating a police state. On page 54 of this book he says, fear that anarchic tendencies will thereby be let loose is a possibility that is greatly exaggerated, seeing that obvious safeguards exist within and without. Above all, there is the natural cowardice of most men to be reckoned with, not to mention morality, good taste, and, last but not least, the penal code. This fear is nothing compared with the enormous effort it usually costs people to help the first stirrings of individuality into consciousness, let alone put them into effect. And where these individual impulses have broken through too impetuously and unthinkingly, the doctor must protect them from the patient's own clumsy recourse to short-sightedness, ruthlessness, and cynicism. As the dialectical discussion proceeds, a point is reached where an evaluation of these individual impulses becomes necessary. By that time, the patient should have acquired enough certainty of judgment to enable him to act on his own insight and decision, and not from the mere wish to copy convention, even if he happens to agree with collective opinion. Unless he stands firmly on his own feet, the so-called objective values profit him nothing, since they then only serve as a substitute for character, and so help to suppress his individuality. Naturally, society has an indisputable right to protect itself against arrant subjectivisms. But insofar as society itself is composed of de-individualized persons, see, this is the truth. A society itself is composed of de-individualized persons. It is completely at the mercy of ruthless individualists. So here's your dialectic, you see. Let it band together into groups and organizations as much as it likes. It is just this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. So when you think you're fighting something, and you're fighting for individual rights, and you begin to join all these groups, you'll find quickly the group mind takes over, the group mentality takes over, because it forms dogmas and rules right away. You lose your individual ability to reason and think. And then, when these rules become concretized in your mind, the man who comes along, or the woman who comes along, and has the loudest voice and can put it over with the most drama and persuasiveness, becomes your dictator. This is the same for the mob, for millions of people, for a nation, or for a world state. From those who think they're rebelling to those who pretend that they're keeping charge of what is. It's the same thing which happens. We have a multitude of organizations all working under the United Nations, and a multitude more which belong as non-governmental organizations to the United Nations, and they're ripe for a world dictator. Never mind the people at the bottom They are too disorganized with all of their groups and their infighting to band together for anything. So he says here, it's this banding together and the resultant extinction of the individual personality that makes it succumb so readily to a dictator. A million zeros joined together do not, unfortunately, add up to one. Ultimately, everything depends on the quality of the individual. But the fatally short-sighted habit of our age is to think only in terms of large numbers and mass organizations. Though one would think that the world had seen more than enough of what a well-disciplined mob can do in the hands of a single madman. Unfortunately, this realization does not seem to have penetrated very far, and our blindness in this respect is extremely dangerous. People go on blithely organizing and believing in the sovereign remedy of mass action without the least consciousness of the fact that the most powerful organizations can be maintained only by the greatest ruthlessness of their leaders and the cheapest of slogans. Now, it doesn't matter if it's something that's opposing or something that's pretending to keep a hold of and preserve. We're hearing all of that today. But we're hearing it mainly from those who are pretending to preserve it at the tops of governments. And that's terribly frightening. We're hearing propaganda blared every day across the planet with the cheapest of slogans. With old slogans too, which have worked in many tongues down through the ages. To continue on page 56, for those who still believe that they're good and they obey the rules, they'll somehow be saved through religion. Curiously enough, the churches too want to avail themselves of mass action in order to cast out the devil with Beelzebub. The very churches whose care is the salvation of the individual soul. They too do not appear to have heard anything of the elementary axiom of mass psychology, that the individual becomes morally and spiritually inferior in the mass, and for this reason they do not burden themselves overmuch with the real task of helping the individual to achieve a metanoia, or rebirth of the spirit. Dio concedente. It is unfortunately only too clear that if the individual is not truly regenerated in spirit, society cannot be either. For society is the sum total of individuals in need of redemption. I can therefore see it only as a delusion when the churches try, as they apparently do, to rope the individual into a social organization and reduce him to a condition of diminished responsibility, instead of raising him out of the torpid, mindless mass and making clear to him that he is the most important factor, and that the salvation of the world consists in the salvation of the individual soul. It is true that mass meetings parade such ideas before him and seek to impress them on him by dint of mass suggestion, with the unedifying result that when the intoxication has worn off, the mass man promptly succumbs to another even more obvious and still louder slogan. His individual relation to God would be an effective shield against these pernicious influences. Did Christ ever call his disciples to him at a mass meeting? Did the feeding of 5,000 bring him any followers who did not afterwards cry, "Crucify him," with the rest, when even the rock named Peter showed signs of wavering? And are not Jesus and Paul prototypes of those who, trusting their inner experience, have gone their own individual ways, disregarding public opinion? This argument should certainly not cause us to overlook the reality of the situation confronting the church. When the church tries to give shape to the amorphous mass by uniting individuals into a community of believers with the help of suggestion and tries to hold such an organization together, it is not only performing a great social service, but it also secures for the individual the inestimable boon of a meaningful life form. These, however, are gifts which as a rule confirm certain tendencies and do not change them. As experience unfortunately shows, the inner man remains unchanged, however much community he has. His environment cannot give him as a gift that which he can win for himself only with effort and suffering. On the contrary, a favorable environment merely strengthens the dangerous tendency to expect everything to originate from outside. On page 59 he says, "Where the many are, there is security." He's talking about how mass movements think. Where the many are, there is security. What the many believe must of course be true. What the many want must be worth striving for, and necessary, and therefore good. In the clamour of the many there lies the power to snatch wish fulfillments by force. Sweetest of all, however, is that gentle and painless slipping back into the kingdom of childhood, into the paradise of parental care, into happy-go-luckiness and irresponsibility. All the thinking and looking after are done from the top. To all questions there is an answer, and for all needs the necessary provision is made. The infantile dream state of the mass man is so unrealistic that he never thinks to ask who is paying for this paradise. The balancing of accounts is left to a higher political or social authority, which welcomes the task, for its power is thereby increased, and the more power it has, the weaker and more helpless the individual becomes. Wherever social conditions of this type develop on a large scale, the road to tyranny lies open, and the freedom of the individual turns into spiritual and physical slavery. Since every tyranny is ipso facto immoral and ruthless, it has much more freedom in the choice of its methods than an institution which still takes account of the individual. Should such an institution come into conflict with the organized state, it is soon made aware of the very real disadvantage of its morality, and therefore feels compelled to avail itself of the same methods as its opponent. In this way, the evil spreads almost of necessity, even when direct infection might be avoided. The danger of infection is greater where decisive importance is attached to large numbers and statistical values, as is everywhere the case in our Western world. The suffocating power of the masses is paraded before our eyes in one form or another every day in the newspapers, and the insignificance of the individual is rubbed into him so thoroughly that he loses all hope of making himself heard. The outworn ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity help him not at all, as he can direct this appeal only to his executioners, the spokesman of the masses. Resistance to the organized mass can be effected only by the man who is as well organized as in his individuality as the mass itself. I would add to that, not only well organized in your individuality, but you're comfortable with your individuality. Most people lose it because they're not comfortable being an individual. It becomes a burden to them. They want acceptance.